He lost a very tough match.
Look what Quinton does. He's giving a yellow card to the referee.
This was Rampage's entire career in Japan. Jokes and slams, and then slams and jokes. Well, there were also Silva's knees, but it wasn't as fun as everything else. Today we have a review of the funniest MMA fighter in King of Slams, Quinton Rampage Jackson, who was a real star of the Pride and one of those few who, after shining in Japan, came to UFC and became a champion there. From the very childhood that wasn't sweet, he dealt with drugs and regular street fights, and if life took him away from drugs, then the fights became his bread and butter in the future. From the age of 17, Rampage took up wrestling and performed quite well at the school level, and he wanted to connect his future with this sport. But then he saw how wrestlers dominate MMA and decided to also try his hand at this difficult subject. In 1999, Quinton began his long journey by beating Mike Pyle by decision, and then fought against Marco Bermudos in some basement in Huntington Beach. Rampage mercilessly slammed Marco and then finished him with a choke, and this wild amplitude slams became his calling card, from which Japanese stadiums exploded with delight and pissed fire. And some even had the pleasure of getting to know the idol personally. Losing his third fight by decision to Marvin Eastman, which was for the King of the Cage heavyweight title, Jackson began to rack up records and produce wins in the minor leagues, but many of them are not online. And this is how Rampage started his fight against Rocco Henderson in 2001 for the light heavyweight belt of the King of the Cage. It was just a masterclass from Jackson, how to blanket and lie down opponents. The second round starts the same way. Slam from Jackson, torment on the canvas, and Kimura for dessert. So this performance was just as dominant as Jackson's fight against the Door at the Ultimate Fighter show. After winning 2 more fights in the King of the Cage, Quinton received an offer to compete in the Pride, and charming Japanese usually made such offers that no one refused. So he made his debut at the Pride 15 tournament, and as a rite of passage, Quinton got the main Japanese fighter Kazushi Sakuraba, who interrupted the Gracie hunting season and agreed to test the newcomer. The gong sounds and Saku takes Rampage to the ground, but he can't keep him on the canvas for a long time and Jackson gets to his feet. After landing, Sakuraba tries to throw a triangle on Rampage, but this usually only provokes Jackson into slam, and he starts drumming Sakuraba on the floor. Unfortunately for Rampage, Saku could take damage for hours, since in this regard he was completely unlimited. Rampage was simply exhausted by all these beautiful throws, and Saku classically made a comeback and finished a larger and more powerful opponent with a chokehold. But in fact, there were no losers that evening. Saku confirmed his status as a superstar and comeback master, and Rampage made his Pride debut and showed the public what it loves, so he was definitely remembered. Not being able to beat the main Japanese, Rampage decided to fight himself back on the weaker fighters. First, the pro wrestler Alexander Otsuka was beaten, and then it was the turn of Yuki Ishikawa. Just a sparkling start and a slam from Rampage, and then an addition in the form of crazy knees to the head, after which I'm worried about the health of the Japanese. Rampage just ran over Yuki by shooting him at the ropes, and this quick knockout was the first in Jackson's career. Having caught the courage, Rampage fired to kill and demolished all the Japanese on his path. He didn't pass by Daiyo Matsui, or rather by his balls, which were subjected to superpower processing. So Matsui is knocked out and Jackson lost by disqualification. In April 2002, Quinton faced off against another Japanese karateka and kickboxer, Masaaki Satake, who clearly wanted revenge for the Japanese comrade's broken balls. Or at least Rampage took it that way when he complained to the indifferent referee. And here is the first slam from Quinton, who takes side control and tries to crack the head of the Japanese like an Easter egg. So things were very sad for Masaaki, cause Quinton made it one-sided. After such an amplitude suplex, the fight was over and the referee, however with little hesitation, stopped the furious Rampage, who was just relentless. But don't you think that Jackson brought to Japan only rage, pain and suffering? He also did good and taught the Japanese English absolutely free of charge. So for such actions, of course, he has a special respect.
Say it again. Real tough, real tough.
Read out?
Yeah.
I suck dick. I suck dick.
I have big tits.
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 I'm a fag. Say it again. Say it again. Alright, look at me.
I'm a fag.
In September 2002, Quinton was supposed to fight the Thunder of Eight Igor Vovchanchyn, but he couldn't enter this fight without preparation, so he went to warm up on Sean Gray in the King of the Cage, whom he slammed in the third round. Before the fight itself, Rampage gave Igor a note, and according to Vovchanchyn, who didn't speak English, he was distracted throughout the fight thinking about what might be written there. The beginning of the fight took place at a leisurely pace and a wrestling clinch, where the fighters exchanged knees and annoyed the referee, who soon separated them into the corners. It was just a cruel slam from Rampage, after which he went to full mount and unleashed a flurry of blows on Igor. Vovchanchyn survived the storm and managed to get back on his feet, but Rampage had an equally wild slam and continued to dominate the ground, and soon Igor grabbed his ribs and tapped in surrender. As it turned out after the fight, the note contained a request to Igor not to hurt Jackson. Some sources indicate that the note was from Jackson's mother, and others that it was from Rampage himself. But the most important thing is that it fulfilled its function, and Jackson prevailed. In addition, beating Igor Vovchanchyn was far from the same as sticking Japanese pro wrestlers into the canvas, so Rampage's shares were gaining weight. After finish of Igor, Jackson fought monster Kevin Ranzelman, who after losing the UFC belts won 5 fights in a row and the last 3 in the Pride, so the monster was still perfectly well. The fight started quite actively, but then its energy began to fade and die in the clinch near the ropes, so it's not surprising that the referee soon reacted and parted the fighters in the corners. Rampage delivered a powerful knee from the clinch and added an uppercut, after which the monster collapsed and was finished off on the ground by the disapproving look of Silva. This victory over the monster became a serious beat for the championship fight, and Rampage turned to Silva, but Wanderlei had a nice butt hurt and jumped into the ring. He made a little mess, which became the beginning of their confrontation. Instead of meeting Silva, Rampage had a fight against Pride's newcomer, sambo wrestler from Russia, Mikhail Ilyukhin, who fought in the first Absolutes in the 90s and then all his career in the rings. Striking technique wasn't Mikhail's strong point, and he had most of his victories by submissions, so in this fight he didn't change himself and tried to finish Jackson with a sub. There was an attempt for the guillotine and then the same unsuccessful Kimura. In general, that was all, otherwise the fight was dictated by Jackson, who sprawled Ilyukhin's takedowns and smashed the opponent with hammer fists and knees. These knees turned out to be too destructive for Mikhail, and at the 7th minute he capitulated, tapping in a sign of surrender. So aside from Matsuo's crackballs and Sakuraba's defeat, Rampage was in a good streak. All these achievements secured for Jackson a place in the 2003 8-fighter Middleweight Grand Prix, and most importantly, the champion Wanderlei Silva, who was eager to tear Rampage's throat, took part in it, and it was mutual. Rampage started the Grand Prix by defeating Jiu-Jitsu master and former UFC champion Murilo Bustamante, whom he beat by split decision, and Silva in the first round beat Kazushi Sakuraba, for whom every fight with Silva ended in a beating and a bloodbath. In addition to Silva and Jackson, another fighter took part in this Grand Prix, whose head was especially valuable and everyone wanted to hang it on their trophy wall. It was Chuck Liddell, who, accompanied by Dana White, arrived to the territory of the main competitor, with the mission of destroying the Pride's main middleweight. Before getting to Silva, Iceman had to nail Alistair Overeem and in the semi-finals fight Rampage, for whom this battle became a matter of principle after the president of the Pride personally asked Jackson to smash Chuck.
Get it over.
Iceman started this fight well, working from a distance, but then he ran into two powerful counter jabs, which were backed up by two right buns. Chuck tried to work as the first number, but it was Quinton's attacks that were sharper and more accurate, so Dana White, who watched this battle from the front rows, was probably nervous. His hope and the best fighter in fact was outrun in the stands by the basic wrestler, and for the picture to be complete, some kind of crazy slam from Rampage was missing. Rampage dropped Chuck and then, taking top position, crushed his body with punches to the pleasant buzzing of the Japanese audience, who wanted Iceman's blood. Chuck's corners realized that there would be no luck today and threw in the towel, after which the referee stopped the fight. So the battle between Chuck and Silva didn't take place, to the huge regret of many, and Liddell's business trip ended in failure, after which Iceman returned to UFC and no longer appeared on Japanese soil. Quinton advanced to the Grand Prix final, which took place that same evening. At the same time, Wanderlei also couldn't pass the semi-finals without wasting forces, as he faced serious resistance from the judoka Hidehiko Yoshida, whom he defeated by decision in the Fight of the Year in 2003. The beginning of the battle, and Rampage charges Vandy for a slam, but instead of flying over the cuckoo's nest, he carefully puts the opponent on the canvas and frees his head from the lock. Vandy goes for the sub, but no luck, and this attempt seems to unleash Quinton, and he starts an execution, throwing Silva with powerful blows. What happened next was more like a genocide, about which Silva knew a lot. Without a drop of mercy, he crushed Rampage with his knees, and even despite Jackson's smile, Rampage was clearly not laughing. The referee stopped the fight and Silva became the Middleweight Grand Prix champion, and after the fight, despite the differences, the fighters showed mutual respect and closed the first of 4 chapters of this fierce confrontation. After recovering from a thrashing from Wanderlei, Quinton had a lot of fun with another Japanese fighter, Ikuhisa Minowa, whom he finished in the second round, and after the fight almost caused a mess, because the Japanese didn't like something very much and wanted to arrange a revenge without hesitating. Jackson's next step was the fight against the strongest grappler from Brazil, Ricardo Arona, who at the time of the fight with Rampage had a record of 8-1 and also became the champion of ADCC tournaments 3 times, where he never lost at all. Arona didn't rush things, and instead of going to the ground, he started with the destruction of Jackson's legs, and then after the clinch he closed the guard to pull Rampage down. On the canvas, Arona knitted Quinton well and tried to go for the submission, and also exploded once and threw really powerful axe kicks. Well, then there was an event that was included in all Prix and Jackson's highlights.
He's got to get out. Try him. Dan, I told you, he picked him up and slammed him to the ground. He's out. He knocked him out.
Monstrous amplitude slam from Rampage, and Arona is in a deep knockout. It was one of the most brutal and famous slam knockouts in the history of Pride, although opinions regarding its legality divided, since on the replay it is clear that Arona flies with the back of his head into the canvas. This knockout opened the way for Quinton to a championship fight against the baddest comrade Wanderlei Silva, who after the first destruction of Jackson only strengthened his legacy by beating 2 more Japanese. Remembering what happened in their first fight, Rampage rang his lawyer just in case and made a will. You never know what could happen in a fight with Silva. The fight began with a leisurely exchange of knees in the clinch, but Rampage's kick in the balls activated Silva, who began to pick up the pace and swoop at Rampage in serious.
Wow. Look at this. Beautiful job now by Jackson. Jackson's got him down. Beautiful.
One of the exchanges ended with a takedown from Jackson and Vandy's attempt of triangle, and then Rampage kept Silva on the canvas until the referee freaked out and raised the fighters to the stands. Rampage drops Silva and fully turns on, so these last minutes of the first round became the most difficult for Silva in both fights. Who knows if gave Rampage another minute and the fight could be over, but the gong sounded and the fight went into the second segment. The second round immediately began with an exchange and a takedown. Wanderlei decided to crush Rampage's head with stomps, but his bloodthirstiness allowed Quinton to get back on his feet and continue the bloodbath. Silva shocked Rampage and then entered the clinch and already by the classics sentenced Jackson with his knees, although this time the knockout was just cruel and only doctors could help. This finish can rightfully be considered one of the toughest in the history of the Pride and Silva's personal list. This fight was awarded a knockout and a fight of the year in 2004. Well, as for Rampage himself, for some time he probably woke up at night in a cold sweat remembering those crushing knees of Silva. After this loss to Silva, Jackson fought both Hua brothers, first winning by a split decision against the elder Murillo and in my opinion unfairly, and then fought Mauricio at the first stage of the Grand Prix in 2005. In this fight, Mauricio just ran over Rampage by smashing him in a tie clinch and then finishing off with soccer kicks. So already at the 5th minute the fight was over, but Rampage had nothing to be ashamed of, since no one could stop the young Shogun that year, and he became the champion of that Grand Prix. These soccers were well remembered by Rampage, and already in his next fight he himself scored Japanese Hirotaka Yokoi with stomps. And then, having won a decision against Yoongdong Sik, Rampage left the Pride and ended up in UFC, where he soon fought again against Chuck Liddell, and having scored a knockout of the night he became the light heavyweight champion and was also awarded the Fight of the Year in 2007 according to Sherdog. Well, that's all for me. Put a slam if the video came in and write your comments for promoting. And if you're not subscribed, subscribe and press the bell. See you all soon.